Hi, welcome to Neuroverse, a podcast hosted by Carolina
and Clara, where we discuss all matters from neuroscience to philosophy and beyond.
Today's episode is on geometric collective decision-making, and to help us with this episode, we are joined by Professor Iain Couzin. Professor Iain Couzin is the director of the Max Planck Institute of Animal Behavior and a professor and director of the German Research Foundation Excellence Cluster, the Center for the Advanced Study of Collective Behavior at the University of Konstanz in Germany. Previously, Iain was a full professor in the Department of Ecology and Evolutionary Biology at Princeton, Harvard. His work aims to reveal the principles that underlie evolved collective behavior, and therefore he researches a wide range of biological systems such as insect swarms, fish schools, and primate groups. Professor Iain has also won several prestigious awards in recognition of his research, including the Searle Scholar Award in 2008 for the top 5 most cited papers of the decade in animal behavior research between 1999 and 2010, the National Geographic Emerging Explorer Award in 2012, the Scientific Medal of the Zoological Society of London in 2013, a Web of Science global highly cited researcher, the Lagrange Prize for Fundamental Contributions to Complexity Science in 2019, the Falling Walls Life Science Award, and the Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz Prize, Germany's highest research honor in 2022, the Rothschild Distinguished Fellowship at the University of Cambridge in 2023, and the Fison International Prize in 2024. Welcome to the podcast, Iain.
Thanks.
Such amazing awards and incredible papers. I wanted to ask, just to get us started, about your journey, where you started, and how you got interested in group decision making.
So I was always interested in animals. As a kid growing up, I would, collect beetles and ants and all sorts of, creatures, and I always loved to be out so it wasn't really a scientific interest. It was more of an interest in natural history, in the diversity of life, and in particular behavior. So really it came from a sort of non-scientific perspective initially, really the beauty and the fascination of animal behavior.
And linking to that, I noticed that across your many publications, you've carried out research into several different types of organisms, from schooling fish to swarming insects. And so I was wondering if you could elaborate a bit on the different species that you have worked with and the settings you've worked with them in, from in the wild to a lab setting and computational modeling.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. So, I think to understand life on our planet, we have to appreciate and study the diversity of life. And so, when working with collective behavior, we've literally looked at the simplest animal on the planet, called a placozoa, a group of thousands of cells that coordinate their behavior in the very simplest organisms, all the way up through creatures like octopus, which are incredibly smart, but are mollusks, so independently evolved to, as you said, schooling fish, swarming insects, primate groups, and also humans. So really, it's sort of the full spectrum of animals. And we use computational approaches both in terms of data acquisition, tracking large collectives of cells or swarms of locusts to schools of fish, both in the lab and increasingly using deep learning in the field. But we also use computation to model these systems, to create sort of virtual versions of reality, to really interrogate and ask how behavior may arise within these types of individuals and groups.
Amazing. It's really impressive, the diverse range of animals that you've studied. I wanted to dive in a little bit more specifically about one of your papers involving mass migrating animal groups. And so in your paper titled From Disorder to Order in Marching Locusts, you point out that theoretical models have predicted mass migrating animal groups that share group level properties, irrespective of the type of animal in the group. Could you explain to us how this may be the case?
So that paper was published in around 2006, I believe, and so we were very interested in how why do flocks of birds and schools of fish and swarms of animals look so similar? Can there be some underlying principles that even though these systems are very different to each other in many respects, such as the complexity of the animals themselves and maybe how they sense their world, nonetheless, there is this sort of similarity in collective properties. And so that was the idea there was, can we take these simple models from statistical mechanics and statistical physics that have actually come from trying to understand things like magnets. Why is a magnet magnetic? Because all these little particles in the magnet tend to align with each other. So what if we imagine that the magnetic particles are not fixed in place as they are in a magnet, but are kind of on the move as they are with animals? Can, we translate that theory, to animal groups?
Yeah. And what did you find?
Well, it's actually an interesting story, and this also tells us something else about the scientific process. So that paper in 2006 was published in a prestigious journal called Science, and we made this argument, and we used experimental data from swarming locusts that tested a key prediction of this theory from statistical physics, which is that as you change the density of the locusts, the number of individuals, they should change from a sort of gas where they're wandering around, bumping into each other, but there's not any collective order, to suddenly almost like a fluid, like a driven fluid, where they align with each other and they move together. And we argued that we had very good data, good congruence between the theory, what's called a phase transition. So very much like, if you heat up water, it turns to a gas. If you cool it, it goes to a liquid. We argued that this type of transition was occurring within these groups. Now, interestingly, just about 4 weeks ago, we published another paper also in Science where we showed that that was completely wrong. So this is so I think it was an important stepping stone. But now with a reanalysis of those data, but importantly, using modern tools like virtual reality for animals, where we can put animals into a sort of immersive virtual environments, we've actually found that that's not at all the case. So we were wrong. And this is, important to note in science is that, it progresses as technology changes. It can also progress in terms of how you consider the world to work, and mistakes can be made. And so I think the main story there, um, is that we really had to advance our understanding, to have this new perspective on biology.
Yeah, I noticed that, and I have to say, my first thought was like, wow, I really admire that they were commenting on your original model and how it contradicts the more recent findings. Um, I thought it was a really interesting approach in that most recent paper where you used virtual reality with locusts, and I was wondering if you could explain a little bit about that study and that approach and what you found through that.
So one of the great challenges of understanding collective behavior is, even if there's just two of us interacting, that's still a dynamic, right? I might be more influential at some times, you more influential at other times. But if there's a third individual, is that individual influencing me directly, or are they influencing you and you are then influencing me? What if there's a fourth or a fifth individual? So it becomes really difficult to untangle this network of communication and to really understand how an individual responds to social influence, to social input. So one way to resolve this is to immerse animals. It's sort of like in a video game, but in a virtual reality where they are interacting with fully volumetric, so-called sort of holographic virtual conspecifics. Now, for humans to do this, to play a video game in virtual reality, you can put a headset on, and this can give you an immersive virtual world. Now, we can't do that for these little animals, but what we can do is, we can put them in an environment where if we track the eyes of the animal, we can then project on the walls of the environment whatever, it's basically the same equivalent as putting a headset on the animal. We can make them really immerse themselves in this virtual world. They believe themselves to be interacting with real animals, and they are portrayed in this virtual world fully volumetrically, like really in genuine 3D. So, in the case of the locusts, we have them on a big ball. And as the locust moves, the ball moves to always keep the locust on top. And then we can project the world with three projectors in its worldview because they can see almost all the way around. And in this way, we can project, photorealistic virtual locusts that they believe to be in the environment with them, but we are controlling them. So we can control the sensory input to understand how does that input relate to the behavioral output. And in this way, we can test our theories. For example, does changing the density of the individuals change, this transition from disorder to order, or perhaps it's other factors. So it gives us this precise control, and that's not sort of instead of traditional experiments. It's in complement with. So we also do conduct experiments within the lab to test these ideas. The virtual reality often allows us to develop a theory, and then we can test that in the lab, and also importantly, also in the wild.
So, am I right in thinking that the initial idea is that an individual's behavior was guided by the density of the environment it was in? And now the idea is more that an individual's decision of where it moves is based on its immediate sensory input?
So what we thought we saw in the past was as you change the density of the animals, they would go from disorder, so moving around a bit like a gas, to order. And we assumed that this was because that's exactly the prediction from the theory of statistical physics. As you change the density of individuals, they go from a gas to a liquid state. And we just, our initial objective with the virtual reality was just to replicate that. We thought that was true, therefore let's replicate that. But in reality, if density is always correlated with order, so you always get low density and low order here being the alignment of the individuals, to high density and high order. Well, if we just have this curve in reality, then there's these whole regions that we can't really explore. What happens if there's high density and low order? What happens if there's low density and high order? Because we don't see that in our experiments, we can't really explicitly disassociate. Are they aligning because of the order is high and the order is low, or are they aligning because the density, which is correlated with that, is high and low? And so the nice thing about virtual reality is you can decouple these things. We can show high density, low order, to high density, high order in a continuum. Similarly at low density and for all the densities in between. So we can conduct a full scan of what's called parameter space between density and order. And we thought what we will just see is this curve. That's what we thought, and we just couldn't find any relationship with density at all. They cared only about order. So low density, like very low density, but high order, so individuals aligned with each other, was as influential as very high density and order. So it's not the quantity of information, it's the quality of information that was important. And that's very different to the classical theory. The classical theory is that each individual is very noisy, and as you add more individuals, they kind of cancel the noise. If you imagine, each of us is trying to move like to go towards somewhere we're not quite sure about. And I think it's slightly to the right, you think it's slightly to the left, and perhaps you get it spot on. If we merge that information together by following each other, we can make a more accurate decision. And that's kind of what we thought. It's like the sort of wisdom of crowds. We kind of thought that was the mechanism because that's what physics told us. But when we actually did the experiment, it turns out that the animals are really, really good at acquiring information. And that in actual fact, there was no relationship with density. And so we could then go back to our original experiments and say, well, there's two hypotheses here. One is that the virtual reality is not good enough. It's not capturing a biological relationship that we know because of some problem with our system, or that we were wrong in our original experiments. And so when we analyzed our original experiments, we realized that we'd made a statistical error in the analysis. And in actual fact, there was never a density-dependent effect there in the first place. There appeared to be one, but it was a statistical artifact. And this actually has then allowed us now to realize that this statistical problem occurs in many papers, not just our papers, but many papers, both in humans and non-human animals. And so now we're writing up a more general warning to the field, look, we made this mistake, we discovered it this way, but you may have also accidentally made this mistake, so we can then communicate this and help other people really, interpret, when you see something that looks like a clear pattern, unless you have what's called a null model, like a statistical model of what would happen if the individuals weren't, you know, following our theory. What if they were just behaving randomly? Sometimes these null models can produce very strong patterns as you change the number of individuals. But that pattern itself looks like a biological phenomenon, but in actual fact, it's a statistical artifact of the number of individuals.
I really admire the commitment to science and making sure that no one else repeats the same mistake and being able to adapt and taking what you saw in the virtual reality and then updating your hypothesis and the following experiments. When you were talking about the virtual reality, I was lucky enough to see Ian present at the SWC and I saw the little setup with the locust walking along. I thought that was really cool. But then you also use drones as well to look at the whole behavior of. But if density doesn't play a role and locusts use other cues to inform their decision as to how to move as a collective, how can that happen when there are thousands of locusts? How can they integrate all of that information? And again, how do you move from being disordered to ordered, especially when locusts, if they're alone, they can be solitary and they can work very well alone, but then when you put them in a scenario where like resources are scarce, they group together and then they move as a collective.
Yes, so you're absolutely right that locusts actually exist in these two different types, so-called solitarius, where they're green, shy, cryptic grasshoppers. So most people don't know this, but locusts don't like to be together. If they have plenty of food and they're left alone, they will just live very much like the shy little grasshoppers we have in our gardens and parks. But as you said, when they're sort of forced to come together or food is short, then they transition to this gregarious type, and that's when they form swarms. And so, there clearly is a density dependent effect. It's obviously if an individual cannot interact with anyone else, then it will behave differently than if it can. And so what we kind of showed is that across a very broad range of densities, including in the wild, in all of the studies that have been done in the wild, there is no role of density, which suggests that locusts are very, very good at maintaining swarms, even when there are huge fluctuations in density, which is useful, right? Because it's not just the fluctuations in density that's important, it's the effective density. And what I mean by that is, whether you see other individuals. Now, if you're moving in an environment that's barren, a barren desert, then you can see quite far, right? But if you're moving through brush or vegetation, then individuals may be occluded. You may have the same density, but you now can't see other individuals. And so we think that this behavior has really evolved to be largely density independent, to allow them to still keep going in the same direction, even when there's occlusion, even when the population decreases in size. So they're very resilient to density. And as I said in our previous work, where we thought we saw a density effect, there isn't one. But you're absolutely right that when you get to a very low density, then they transition to a different type of locust. And so density is important in their lives, but just not in the way that we thought, or not in the only way that we thought.
But when they move together as a group, like they don't necessarily have a leader, do they? It's not really a dominant type thing. So how do they know which direction to go? And is there a role that uncertainty or indecisiveness play in how they move together as a group?
Yeah, absolutely. So even though the desert locusts that we study and locusts in general, are estimated to impact the livelihood of 1 in 10 people on the planet through food shortage and food security, we do not know how and why they choose the directions that they travel. So, in our recent science paper, we reported from the swarms that we saw that there was some sort of correlation, but we've got absolutely no. If you try to relate that, for example, to the position of the sun, to winds, to the gradients of the environment, we, as others have found in the past, find no relationship. And so that's, that's one of the next things we want to study in virtual reality. How do they choose a specific direction, or do they, or is it entirely random? And you also mentioned, that there are no leaders. That's also true. That these are massive swarms with, potentially billions of individuals. But in other systems that we study, in other groups we study, like we've studied baboons, for example. In baboons, there's a linear hierarchy. All males are dominant to all females, and there's an alpha male. And if watch television, it's often the alpha male decides this, the alpha male decides that. But when we actually track the individuals and look at their decisions, that's not true. So even when there is a hierarchy within the system, that hierarchy relates to dominance and access to females. It doesn't necessarily relate to the movement decisions. Okay, so I think we have to be kind of cautious here. But you also mentioned the sort of error or noise. And actually, I'm working right now on a paper. I literally have it in front of me here about hierarchy and noise and how that impacts collective movement. And it turns out both play a role. So if you assume that the environment is not barren, completely barren, and there are actually objects, there's vegetation, there's paths, there's things like that. Well, it turns out that both noise and hierarchy can improve the ability of swarms to stay together and to move through these environments. So completely egalitarian swarms with very low noise, are not so good. They're very good in barren environments, but they're pretty bad in environments with objects, with occlusions. And actually, a good way to solve that problem, it might seem counterintuitive, is to be more noisy. So individuals that have got more error actually do better at staying together when the environment is more complex, up to a point, and then it suddenly collapses if there's too much error. Similarly, in such environments, actually, for those species who may have a hierarchy, this can also benefit them, at least in very low noise conditions. And for us, I think the locusts are using noise. They're actually adding error to their decisions, and that counterintuitively, we've shown, allows the swarm to be more stable.
So why do you think noise helps, and why do you think that specifically in individuals being noisy or being susceptible to noise helps with their decision making?
So, in general, noise is very important for decision making. So, we've also studied, for example, how the brain makes decisions within the individuals. And again, the optimal brain actually is not a completely perfect entity with no noise. The optimal brain actually has noisy communication among the neurons. And we've shown this in a variety of contexts, from being within collectives, within groups making decisions, but also even individuals on their own making decisions. There's a sort of optimal amount of noise. Too much noise makes bad decisions, but also too little noise means the systems get locked and they're inflexible and unable to sort of find new solutions when they appear, even if that's like a new path through the environment or new objects in the environment. And so this is something that's been known for some time in individual decision making, or even individual sensing. There's a process called stochastic resonance, whereby actually adding noise to animal sensing increases their sensitivity. So it's a very interesting thing, that actually error is adaptive in nature. Just, much like, if you had no mutations, then animals couldn't evolve because you need to explore these sort of different possibilities. And, if you're in a changing environment. So the brain is kind of tuning its robustness, too much noise and you can't make any decisions, but tuning sort of robustness and flexibility.
I was wondering, so just using the locusts again as an example, if the main impacting factor guiding their behavior is the quality of the information, then does this mean that they try to find order within their local environment, so they try to align with their common neighbors?
Yeah, that's right. So they're aligning with those neighbors that they see
Okay.
within their environment.
So I was just wondering if this is a potential universal mechanism across many different collective behaviors, because I was reading about how in ant colonies the behavior at the colony level is very ordered, but at the individual level is very disordered. And so maybe I've interpreted it wrong, and this is a different meaning of order and disorder. But yeah, I was just wondering this is always the case, that the order at the individual level mimics the order at the wider level.
So I think there is a potentially a very interesting analogy there, but I would say actually it's possibly more the analogy between the neurons in the brain and the colony, i.e., the brain's decisions. So if you think about ant colonies, they are really like fluid neural networks. They are computational entities that are making decisions together. So exactly as you said, each individual ant can be noisy, but the decisions themselves can be flexible and accurate. It's much like the neurons in the brain can be noisy, and neural communication is very noisy. Yet decision making can be close to optimal or extremely accurate. So I think at that level, you really can connect the ant colony as this sort of mobile fluid brain to what's going on and that's because the level of selection is really to optimize decision making at the level of the colony. Now, when we deal with locust swarms, there's no concept of the swarm itself optimizing anything. Individuals may have evolved, for example, to be very robust at maintaining directions of travel, but that's probably just to get out of nutrient poor areas and to get somewhere else. I don't think the swarm itself is tuned, for example, to do anything more than be very robust to move together. It's because there's no selection on sort of level of selection operating.
Yeah, and that links to a kind of different question I had, which is a more general one about the purpose of collective behaviors, because as you said, they look quite similar at the surface level. And I was reading
Yeah.
a bit into how fish swim following different like undulations of the fish around them to that is thought to be energy efficient, although it's controversial. And so, is energy efficiency like a major purpose of collective behavior, or are there also other things?
So I think there are many other things, such as responsiveness to changing environments or avoiding predators or finding food. But certainly with schooling fish, you're absolutely right. There's been a long-standing theory for literally hundreds of years that there may be some energetic benefit by swimming together. And the reason it's been controversial is that the problem here is that if a fish is on its own, a schooling fish is on its own, it's very stressed. And so its metabolism and its, heart rate goes up because it's stressed. And therefore, if you put multiple fish together, they're less stressed, and so it appears as if the group is more efficient. But it may be more efficient independently from the hydrodynamic benefits, just because the individuals are less stressed. And furthermore, people didn't have a theory for what fish should do to minimize energy. So there was a famous Nature paper, I think in maybe 72, that suggested they should be in this lattice formation to exploit the vortices shed by others, shed by those ahead. They should be in this specific positions, and only by being in those specific positions could they benefit. And then there was a follow-up paper by another group, I think also in Nature, that showed for 9 species of fish that they're not in these fixed positions, and that they're fluid, they're moving around with respect to each other. And then I think it was in 2021 we finally cracked this problem. And the way we did it was to use robots. So we created robots that swim exactly like fish, and we could show that they produce the same vortices as fish. But with a robot, we can ask, how much energy are you consuming? The robots don't get stressed. And also, with the robots, we could put them in different configurations and ask, is there a rule that they could use, irrespective of relative position, that would allow them to save energy? And it turned out that sort of hidden in plain sight was a very simple rule. They just need to adjust what's called the phase difference. So whether their tails are synchronized, anti-synchronized, or somewhere in between as a function of front-back distance. And then, by running these robotic experiments, we could go, wow, the robots can do it. If the robots do this, then they could save a lot of energy. We then developed a model of the fluid to explain why the robots saved energy. And then we conducted experiments with real fish to ask, do the real fish use the rule that we discovered with the robots? And lo and behold, they did. So this was the first direct evidence that fish actually are using interactions to save energy when schooling. But then what we could also do is fish have what's called the lateral line. It's a series of hairs on the body that's evolved to sense pressure and flow in the water. And everybody, including us, thought that this must be the mechanism that they're using to mediate these hydrodynamic interactions. But the cool thing about this system is you can actually destroy it reversibly with antibiotics, so that the hairs get completely destroyed, but they will grow back. So the fish within a few weeks are back to normal. And we could use this to show that if we removed the sensing capability, they were even better at sensing the flow, not worse, as you would expect. And so this showed us, and also, when we didn't blind the fish, we just turned the lights off. They would very strongly interact hydrodynamically. So we could show it's probably what's called proprioception. Just like if you put your hand out into the water in a stream, you can feel the flow, right? Your arm is displaced by the flow, or you put your hand outside the car window when you're driving, your hand is displaced and you can feel the flow. That's what we think the fish are doing. They feel the flow coming to them and they respond to that. And this allows them to gain energy. So, yes, in some species of fish, particularly big fish that school together, we think energy efficiency is important. But when you go to tiny little fish like juvenile zebrafish that we study, that are less than a centimeter long, then their entire body is covered by a viscous boundary layer of water. It's like a human trying to move through syrup. And so there's no way that they can sense, they can't produce or sense pressure waves. And so for them, it's entirely visual. Even olfaction, this boundary layer sort of keeps the olfactory molecules away. You're just restricted to diffusion. And so it really does depend on the ecological context. And similarly, fish that are paying attention to energy saving, if a predator is detected, I'm pretty sure that they don't care anything about energy. They just want to respond in the best way. So there's a context dependence to it as well. So I think they're constantly switching. But they could also use hydrodynamics, for example, not to save energy, but to accelerate more quickly. You can kind of use the vortices of others to push yourself faster through the water. And we have evidence that they do that too. So they use the vortices on average to save energy. But when they want to get to the front of the group, they also use them as a sort of ladder to move through the group to get to the front, which is a more effective way of moving. So I think it really depends. Animals are typically have to optimize many objectives, like finding appropriate habitat, maybe finding mates, avoiding predators, finding resources. So it depends on the context, and that's what the brain has evolved typically to allow animals to balance these things, or to, when something like a predator comes, you put all of your commitment into avoiding being eaten, because of
Yeah.
course your fitness then goes to zero.
Yeah, that's such a good demonstration of just the diversity of the natural world and how things are complex, and you have to embrace that and not just try to reduce it. And I also love the demonstration of many different methods being used to sort of really prove your finding.
I mean, yeah, I mean, one fact is, we can do three-dimensional fluid dynamic simulations. But firstly, they take forever on a supercomputer. And secondly, we humans, no matter how smart we are, have not yet solved turbulence. And so we can never fully trust our computational fluid dynamic models. But when we create a physical robot, that interacts, that we can show interacts like a fish, it makes things much faster. And also the turbulence is real. So there's this utility. And also, I should also mention it's not a one-way street. We also learn from the fish how to improve robotics. So it goes kind of both ways. Like we can now, for example, we published a paper recently where we found that if the fish are kind of noisy, if the tails are kind of not beating very smoothly, but there's a sort of noise in there, the propulsion goes way up. So actually, which is again, a counterintuitive thing. It's about the sort of the tiny little micro vortices that are shed from the tail. Now we're going to look at the real fish to see whether natural selection has found ways to add noise to, say, wing beats or tail beats to allow them to gain this extra efficiency. And that was kind of an accidental discovery in the robots that now leads us to maybe look for something that people haven't looked for in the real biological systems.
So I just wanted to ask one last question to wrap up the episode about collective minds. You wrote this paper titled Collective Minds, and you mentioned Darwinism and a few other thought leaders about studying collective behavior. Could you tell us a little bit more about that paper?
Yes, so there's this fascinating work done, in the Victorian times, there was this fascination with telepathy. And there was a gentleman called Edmund Sellis, who was, a confirmed Darwinian, but he also was fascinated by bird flocks. And he couldn't understand why other people weren't fascinated by bird flocks. Like to him, this is what it's just the most fascinating thing. And so he speculated that there must be thought transference, effectively telepathy. And, on one hand, that seems ridiculous. But on the other, I think there are many mechanisms of interaction, that do not need superstitious explanations, but mechanisms that we don't fully understand. How animals respond to each other. There are still things that we can't explain. And also, potentially there are some connections in terms of how neural groups forming, decisions within the brain could give us insights into how animals also create sort of collective intelligence or collective memory. And I was a bit cautious, to really draw strong parallels, but I thought it was really important that these communities talk more. And actually, over the years, I've become more convinced that there are genuine connections between these scales of organization because computation, especially making decisions in space and time, which is something that all animals do, really has, I think, sort of, fundamental features that, unite systems. The mechanism is very different, how neurons interact, to make decisions in the brain and how, say, birds flock. But the problem that they're trying to solve is actually remarkably similar. And so we're finding in our most recent work that there might be deep parallels in terms of how the brain solves computations and how animals within groups, or i.e., aggregates of brains, solve computations.
Yeah, I think that's fascinating. And as somebody who's interested in understanding the neural basis of memory, I was particularly drawn to this whole idea of collective memory. And I find it really fascinating, how there might be behaviors exhibited at the collective level of acting based on how the previous structure of the collective was, so the collective memory, whereas the individual within that collective might have no clue what this memory is. And it's like a neuron in a circuit may have no idea what the circuit is doing, but it's just playing its role. And yeah, I mean, there's so many layers here, so many scales.
Exactly, and I think it's a similar process. I mean, there are what's called metastable regimes, dynamical regimes that the system collectively gets into, and this, this is to a first approximation how the brain at least stores quite a lot of information, and we even know this from brain states, like over synchronization, for example, can lead to problems. The brain needs to be tuned in certain ways to allow it to sort of maximally process information. And, making a decision is ultimately, in many cases, a collective phenomenon within the neurons. And, it's not that each neuron doesn't know, how it's contributing explicitly, but it is. And I think that's the case in many of these animal groups. They've evolved such that collectively they can very effectively integrate information, even though each individual is kind of noisy, much like each neuron is noisy, but collectively they can be pretty smart and make very good decisions.
Yeah, and linking to that, I did notice some terminology in the computations that are being performed at the collective level that were mentioned in some of your papers, and like computations I've heard of being referenced in the brain, such as out of phase coupled oscillators when it comes to fish, and contact-based mutual excitation, and then ring attractor network dynamics, which I always hear being referred to. And
Right.
so, yeah, there seems to be some truth or some hope in understanding the computations at a more fundamental level, I guess.
Yeah, and that's our focus this year. I would say in the lab, the thing I'm kind of most excited about at the moment is we're working with mathematicians and control theorists and neuroscientists, and we're getting closer and closer. And I really hope to make a big advance this year, to really unifying these different models of computation, models that seem very different, that perhaps come from different disciplines, but we think are actually unifying. And so, yeah, it's, that itself would be an entire another podcast. But, I think, by the end of this year, I think we'll have made some significant sort of mathematical advances in showing that there are these fundamental principles of computation that transcend specific systems, and why computation is so universal is one of the big objectives.
Yeah, that's an amazing place to end today's episode. Thank you so much for joining us, Ian. It's been so enlightening learning all about collective decision making.
Yeah, thank you so much. It's been very admirable seeing and inspirational seeing how you work at the interface of all these different fields, really.
Well, thanks so much for the invitation, and it's been really fun to chat.
Thank you so much for listening to today's episode. If you enjoyed today's episode, please feel free to share it on social media. Our handle is at neuroverse_pod, and check out our website for blogs and more resources. Thanks for listening.